the university's relationship with our community. And it's that fact that sort of launched us off down an architectural design path, as I'm going to argue tonight, wherein and whereby the community and UVic share a common aesthetic and artistic heritage. Now, a word of warning. I look out before the lights dimmed. I noticed a number of people in the room who will remember and be quite comfortable with black and white television, because this is, for the most part, a black and white lecture. Not that the ideas are black and white, but first of all, being a classical old school architectural historian, I believe that buildings show their best through the lens of black and white. And the second reason is actually the buildings we're going to be focusing on over the next little while. I've tried to respect the intentions of the architects and designers as best possible by bringing you images of these structures shortly after their completion. So we're going to look at a cast of characters, people who sort of lay behind this story. We're going to look at some of the products, and in this case it's the design of our own campus and elsewhere in the Greater Victoria area, but particularly focusing on Centennial Square, which was developed at about the same time as the build-out of UVic began. And we'll draw then a few conclusions, I hope, that make some sense. But before I do, just a little bit of the story behind the story. And it goes back a little over a year ago when we'd had the idea for an exhibition based on the theme tonight, the build-out of UVic and the role the building architects from the early years played in also building out Victoria. And I went down to California, that holds the archives of William Worcester, who you'll hear more about in a moment, to consult them on the look at some of the correspondence and perhaps some of the in-house drawings, etc., that go that are part of the design history of UVic, given that Worcester, Bernardi, Emmons were the first consulting advisory architects and planners for UVic. But I'd also heard that Worcester and Emmons in particular had taken a keen interest in Victoria, and that, in fact, may have played some role in assisting or encouraging the city to take the direction it did when it faced its centennial in 1962 and harbored ideas of urban renewal. So it was with some interest that I arrived at the archives, which are held by in the archives of the School of Environmental Design at Berkeley, University of California, Berkeley, and asked if I could access the University of Victoria papers that were in the Worcester collection. And the archivist said, well, would you like the Victoria papers? I said, yes, the University of Victoria. He said, yeah, you like all the Victoria papers, and thinking that she was confusing us, as many do, with another institution in Australia, I was, yes, Victoria, British Columbia. She said, yeah, I know that, yes. Well, it'll take us a day, she said, because the papers are held off campus, so come back tomorrow, present yourself, and I'll have them. Duly did that, right the next day, and there were 3 files laid out in front of me. And the first were fairly thick file on the University of Victoria. And the second, lo and behold, City of Victoria Consulting. And then there was a third file, and it had on it R.B. Wilson. Just those words. So, without giving the whole story away, these characters will pop up as we move along. The cast of characters. One which we were able to discover and add to the mix and hadn't been quite evident in some of the early work on the history of UVic was Bill the Fagoody, who, British-born and educated, diploma from the Architectural Association of London, Edinburgh School of Art, hired by the provincial government as an architect planner. He arrived in Victoria in 1954, serving briefly as their chief architect before retiring in 1975. At the Department of Public Works were a number of people who were to play a role in the development of UVic. Second was Alan Hodgson, a Canadian, who started with DPW in 1952. He graduated from UBC in 1958 and opened his Victoria practice here in 1960. Andy Cochrane started at DPW in 1957, graduated UBC in 1958, senior architect with the DPW, and later joined the Heritage Conservation branch, from where he retired. And finally, well, not quite finally, Jack Wilkinson, British, and we're going, by the way, roughly clockwise. So Jack is on your upper right. British-born and educated in art schools. In the 1960s, served as staff artist and senior architectural draftsman, ending his government career as manager of the BC Art Collections. And finally, Clive Campbell joined DPW in 1949, retired as Deputy Minister of Public Works in 1959, opening a private practice in Victoria, supervised a new generation of architects in government, people like Alan Hodgson, Andy Cochrane, Peter Cotton, and others. It was DPW that really developed the first idea and build-out of the campus, who backstopped the planning for, first of all, for Lansdowne, the proposal to expand Lansdowne, and then to relocate and develop the Gordon Head location. The landscape architects who were to play such an important role in the aesthetics of our campus. Clive Justice, who grew up actually nearby on Salt Spring, educated in Duncan and Victoria, studied landscape architecture at Berkeley, Master of Planning at UBC, and interestingly enough, in 2000, in retirement, completed a PhD at SFU in landscape history. Joined in 1953, the firm becoming Muirhead and Justice in 1960, and those Muirhead and Justice were the first on-site landscape architects for the campus. Desmond Muirhead, his partner, was a plantsman and landscape architect, trained at Cambridge first and then at UBC, opened a practice in 1949 in Vancouver with horticulturist Hans Fischer. Later, they were associating with Clive Justice. John Lancias. Lancias is interesting because he trained under Worcester at Berkeley, working in Halprin's office, and I'll say a word about Halprin in a minute, and then with Clive Justice in 1964, and took on the UVic file with Halprin's blessing. Don Vaughan graduated University of Oregon in 1965, joined with Lancias and assumed the day-to-day work on the UVic file in 1974. And Don Vaughan was able to inform a lot of the history of the development of the landscape plan. What I call the California crew, or the California connection, which is Worcester Bernardi Emmons, large powerhouse firm in San Francisco in the late 1940s through the 50s, with Lawrence Halprin, who actually shared offices with them, although acted independently, Halprin being a landscape architect and designer. Starting your upper left, and sort of going around the clock, is William Worcester. He was a UC Berkeley grad, 1919, mainly residential work in the early years of his practice, entered a partnership with Bernardi in 1944, joined by Don Emmons in 1945. He maintained his architectural practice in San Francisco, but was also Dean of Architecture at Berkeley. He was the person who amalgamated architecture, landscape architecture, city and regional planning at the College of Environmental Design at Berkeley, which he named as such. Theodore Bernardi, born in Yugoslavia, BArch at Berkeley, worked with Worcester from 1934 to 42, and joined a formal partnership in 1944. Then Don Emmons, upper right, New Yorker, BArch from Cornell, 1933. And joining with Worcester in the firm, he assumed the University of Victoria file in 1961 and managed it until, until he retired. And finally, Lawrence Halprin, BA at Cornell, Harvard Graduate School of Design, trained under some of the great luminaries of the modern movement in the United States, Walter Gropius, Marcel Breuer, and interestingly enough, landscape designer and urbanist Christopher Tunnard. Tunnard actually was a graduate, or had done his early years here at the Victoria Normal School, and class him as a Victorian, actually. Halprin was also a classmate with other important American modernist architects like Philip Johnson, I.M. Pei, and did not just the early planning for UVic, but the very well-known Sproul Square at Berkeley, the master landscape plan for the Seattle World's Fair, the UN Plaza in New York, and probably his most famous piece, the Delano Roosevelt Memorial in Washington, D.C. The Victoria part of the cast. Bob Siddle. Bob was the university's first, the college's actually, the Victoria College architect first, and then became lead consulting architect locally for the University of Victoria through the early years. He was a University of Manitoba grad, came through the offices of CBK Van Norman in Vancouver, a brief partnership with P.L. James and F. Murray Polson locally, assuming the practices of James and Hubert Savage. And James and Savage had actually, directly and indirectly, inherited the offices and files of Rattenbury and McClure. So you can see there are deep roots in the community through him. Donald Dennis, UBC, Bachelor of Architecture, 1952, joined Polson's Siddle in 1955, where it became Siddle Dennis Warner shortly thereafter. David Warner, graduate of architecture from the London Polytechnic, practiced in London, arrived in Victoria in 1958, worked with Polson and Siddle in the early years of the campus design, as you can see. He briefly assumed a private practice in Calgary and then rejoined Siddle Dennis, so it became Siddle Dennis Warner. Alan Hodgson, I've introduced to you before, but was out in private practice for his building, his major building here. And then John de Castry. Many of you have heard of de Castry's work. He, Victoria-born and educated, joined DPW as a clerk, worked briefly with Burley Wade in Stockdale, 1948, then went for studies under Bruce Gough at Oklahoma State University. Well, take a look at that in a moment, but traveled and met Frank Lloyd Wright in Taliesin. Was back here in 1951, and after a brief partnership, opened his own practice in 1952. John Wade, lower right, Singapore-born, Architectural Association of London, diploma, 1937, arrived in Vancouver in 1938. Interestingly enough, worked briefly for Richard Neutra in California in 1939. Engineers during the war returned to Victoria to establish a partnership with Patrick Burley and Dexter Stockdale. Very successful practice here, which became ultimately Wade Williams. Charles Stockdale, as you can see, Canadian, University of Manitoba, Winnipeg, and Edmonton, where he worked before joining MacArthur and Nairn in Vancouver, and joined Wade in Victoria in 1949. Rod Clack was to be the city's first architect planner Born in Winnipeg, grew up in Victoria, graduated or did his first 2 years at Victoria College, and then UBC, Bachelor of Architect. Opened a practice in Victoria, Clayton and Pickerston in 1958, and then joined the City of Victoria as its architect planner. Don Wagg, a Brit, trained in Manchester. He was city architect to Peterborough Engineers during the war years, then came to Canada in 1948, helped build out the new hospital at Nelson before moving to Victoria in 1950, where he opened a practice with the former BC chief architect W.H. Whitaker, and then with Patrick Burley, who was a Cambridge mathematician and self-taught architect here in Victoria. Finally, David Hamilton, also a Brit, London Polytechnic, post-war reconstruction and restoration of war-damaged buildings in the immediate years after the war, worked in the offices of Sir Louis de Soissons and Sir Albert Richardson, two of the larger architectural practices in London after the war. 1958, arrived in Victoria, where he joined the Burley-Wagg partnership in 1966. It became Wagg and Hamilton. So the question is, behind these people, was a tradition of modern design. And I just want to spend 2 or 3 minutes looking at sort of what was informing the modern movement, as we call it at that time. Many of these names you'll be familiar with, but perhaps foremost and best known among them was Charles-Édouard Génin, who called himself, shortly after he became an architect, Le Corbusier. And here is his Villa Savoy, one of his famous sort of early buildings, which sort of re-established or established the modern movement in Europe with kind of iconic pieces, this kind of clean, clinical, spare, taking away all extraneous elements, modern materials, cast-in-place forms, concrete, plays between negative and positive space, elemental forms, squares, cylinders, and this notion of lifting the building up on what he called pilotes, or pylons, to above the landscape. Corbusier was also an urban planner designer, and became well known for publishing his ideas on the notion of the La Ville Radieuse, his famous thesis on that in 1923, which was to inspire urban planning around the world that was just coming to grips with high-density cities, how you could organize them in efficient terms, even if sometimes people got left out of the picture, but that's another story. Walter Gropius, who I mentioned a moment ago, German side of it, had worked under the German architect Peter Behrens, but was influenced by the writings of Frank Lloyd Wright. He was one of the founders of the Bauhaus in Germany, but in the 1930s realized National Socialism wasn't going to be good for him, and he left Germany, went first to London, but eventually settled in Boston in 1934, where he taught at Harvard and MIT, and therefore was very influential in a large swath of young American architects in training. And on our own West Coast, you'll recognize certainly the man on the top left, Arthur Erickson, who was born in Vancouver, studied Asian languages at UBC, trained at the University of Toronto, traveled extensively in Scandinavia, and is credited with founding the West Coast modern style. But you can already see in those elements of Simon Fraser, which was built almost same time, or under construction at the same time as the early buildings of UVic, a very different approach to architectural form and function. And you can see the influence of Le Corbusier here in this slide, 2 slides of Simon Fraser. Slightly different, but in the same vein, bringing modernism to the Pacific Northwest was Barry Downes, graduate at the University of Washington, Seattle. He worked with Thomson Burke and Pratt in Vancouver, and then Fred Hollingsworth until he established his own partnership with Richard Archambault in 1959. And it was with Downes's contribution was our own Sedgwick buildings, which you can see. And an interesting take, you see, on the early aesthetic, translating those sort of pure elemental forms into a West Coast cedar vernacular. Also, behind the scenes, or inspiring so much of the architecture of this era, the great personality, Frank Lloyd Wright. And I show just two of his perhaps better-known buildings, Falling Water, for the Mr. and Mrs. Edgar Kaufman, Mill Run, Pennsylvania. And then the other one below, Taliesin West, actually built over a number of years. It was started in 1937, Spring Green, Wisconsin, home of Wright from 1937 on until his death. And it was actually at Taliesin where John de Castries dropped in to see to Wright. The other interesting connection of Taliesin and Wright with Victoria is the fact that Francis Mawson Rattenbury's son trained at Taliesin and eventually taking it over after Wright died and running the foundation there until quite recently, as a matter of fact. And finally, Bruce Gough, who got the mention with de Castries, and I just show these two because they kind of fit together. John trained under Bruce at Oklahoma. Here's his Babinger house. Gough was known for his kind of exciting, wildly exciting takes on the modern aesthetic. And you compare that to the Windsor Utley house designed by John over on Salt Spring Island, just as the University of Victoria was in its early stages of construction. And finally, well, not quite finally, but the community pioneers. First of all, the community leaders who brought UVic into being. Top left, R.B. Wilson, Richard Biggerstaff Wilson, a founding family of Victoria, Oak Bay Reeve, then elected mayor of Victoria in 1962, chaired the community-based University Development Committee, and is credited. He was the sort of lead on the team that engaged Worcester Bernardi Emmons. Judge Clearhue championed the cause, liaised with the government as a member of the Development Committee. Thomas Mcpherson, denizen of the Union Club, UVic, Victoria, realtor and developer, donated $250,000 for the construction of the UVic Library. When he died in 1962, he left a further $2.5 million for the build-out of the university. And a share in a major downtown revenue property. His Mcpherson Playhouse was a gift to the city also, and enabled, in fact, that public facility to anchor what would become Centennial Square, so it's connected to both projects. And finally, and in some ways very important, because the link between the new aesthetic that was to change the face of Victoria and the public were a number of talented people, and I point particularly to three of them. First of all, most of the black and white slides that you've just been looking at were taken by Hubert Norbury, a British-born prairie homesteader, became a newspaper reporter, retired out of the military in 1958, and opened a private photography practice specializing in construction documentation. There he is upper left, one of his photos below, And I'll say a couple of things more about his photos as we look at some of them in a few minutes in more detail. It's, however, because of Hubert that we're able to trace the development of many of the architectural practices in their early years in Victoria today. Secondly, Alan Edwards, Edmonton-born, but grew up in Victoria, an art and interior designer, had studios in Toronto and Detroit. He had private practice specializing in large school design work, but returned to Victoria to open an art school. And among his students were Sid Barron, the cartoonist, Pierre Burton, and Bill Reid. So he specialized in these marvelous watercolor presentation drawings that he was able to take the architectural drawings and interpret them into the moods of the moment and bring them. They were used extensively for the publicity of the university's early years of construction. Fundraising being a good use, as you could guess. Finally, John Faulkner, who studied photojournalism at the New York Institute of Photography, his private work in Vancouver during the 1960s, a star-studded client list of Erickson, Barry Downs, Douglas Cardinal were among the architects which he documented, including the work here of Alan Hodgson in Victoria. So to stitch these people together now in the story, Bill Lafagutti's overhead projector slide is one of the things during our research which we were able to turn up. And it was a slide that he literally must have taken around from everything to cabinet meetings to fundraisers to chambers of commerce, etc., that showed by laying over the two opportunities that faced UVic, whether to build out further on the Lansdowne campus or to develop the new campus, a new campus site at Gordon Head. And on the upper right, I've blown up a small little bird's eye schematic view of his sort of office doodling of what the campus might look like as it would build itself out starting in, well, 1960, 61. So it was Lafagutti who brought this through the period when the university had to reimagine itself. And here was wasn't exactly a greenfield site, part of it occupied by the Army Camp and the Hudson's Bay Company properties, which the university finally did move to acquire. And the dilemma that faced, as you can see, the young building, Victoria Normal School site, which work had already been significant investment there. The Paul building, put up by Public Works, a modernist, clean-line modernist structure, as you can see to the right, dramatically different from the historic earlier young building. And then more recently, centerfold, as it were, the Paul building, also a Public Works design, which was to be the building which would set the tone for the further build-out of the Lansdowne campus. So it was on Bob Siddle's advice that R.B. Wilson and a small group from the University Development Committee went down to California to interview Worcester and to look at the Berkeley campus. That's sort of where the project might go. And if they had arrived, well, it's when they arrived at Berkeley, this is what Berkeley would have looked like at about that time. I just show you an aerial view, wherein it had been under the sort of direction of Worcester and Lawrence Halprin, who had written the development plan for Berkeley that had been pursued for the previous, about 20 years. The work of Worcester Bernardi Emmons was quite interesting. And the slides I'm going to show you are actually taken from a quite influential magazine that was in a lot of artists, architects, designers' offices during our period, the late 1940s and through the 50s. And Worcester was on the board of directors of the magazine, so I suppose that assured that he was covered in it once in a while. But through it you can see what the firm specialized in. It was creative infill, a modernist aesthetic, but inserted into the downtown streets, as you can see, the hillside streets of downtown San Francisco. And you can see it's an architecture that's driven first and foremost by really context. Yes, the buildings demonstrate a new clean line style, but in form, character, they fit well with the streetscape. The magazine sponsored for a number of years what they called their Case Study Houses series. These were problems that were set to architects in the first instance to come up with a house that met certain criteria. And they published, I think the original scheme was to do about a dozen. It ended up, there were over 30 of these designs published during the 1950s, and I think the series finished around 62. And here you can see Worcester Bernardi Emmons, WBE, at work with Lawrence Halpern as landscape architect with a series of houses, this one called just A Small Country House with its Halpern landscape plan at the top. These houses set into the surrounding countryside of California, near desert. And right away you can see there's an attempt in these houses to insert them into the landscape. The house itself almost disappearing through the clever use of materials and edge-to-edge landscaping. From the inside out, the houses link with the exterior through to the gardens by utilizing glass curtain walls, sliding doors, inside-outside balcony decks. The house in these almost disappears, but where you do see it, the materials used are sympathetic and usually developed out of the landscape: local rock, local woods, plenty of light. I mentioned Richard Neutra earlier on. Here is his. Neutra actually contributed more to the case series than almost any other architect. And here I delight you with some color pictures. Neutra was a Hungarian who moved to the United States and infused with the modern movement, but settling in California, adapted it to the landscape and the climate of the region. You can see that, the landscaping with the large boulders, etc. And again, a little more perhaps aggressive than Worcester's work, but still very clean-lined and elemental in its treatment. A couple more, just quickly, by WBE with Lawrence Halpern. This was actually designed for the Stanford campus Center for Advanced Study of, this was the Redwood House out of San Francisco. Minimalist effect, almost total disappearance of the curtain wall as you landscape inside, outside connected. And this is the Center for Behavioral Studies, Behavioral Sciences at Stanford. And here you see how, in a more formal institutional sense, he works with the same palette, really. But Worcester Bernardi Emmons were also noted for being pioneers in urban heritage revitalization in the United States. A couple of their most well-known monuments to this were the San Francisco Concert Hall restoration with Skidmore and Merrill, and the Ghirardelli Square, which now is, of course, a major tourist attraction. Concert Hall upper left and lower left, and Ghirardelli you can see upper right. The Gordon Head campus plan. Bill Worcester comes to Victoria March 26, 1961. And by this time, the firm had been brought on board, and his kind of famous line was listening to the sort of dithering as to whether they should proceed with Lansdowne or pick up and build anew at Gordon Head. He said, build at Gordon Head for 10,000 students. And of course, they were, my goodness, what on earth is he thinking about? 10,000 students. But it turned out to be prescient. And the little story about how the actual first design was produced just came to me very recently through the good offices of our new librarian, who knows Ralph Butterfield, who actually retired out as head of one side of Worcester Bernardi Emmons, who at that time was a project architect with the WBE. And he says how they went away and he stayed up all night to sketch it out. And it was here the basic master plan, which shows a fairly dense campus and how it could be built out, where the main feature, the sort of organizational feature, would be the ring road. So March 1961, by early July, the conceptual map had been developed. And there's a reference to some earlier work that Worcester Bernardi Emmons had done for Cornell University, the Arts Quad. And here, the Arts Quad, you think you've seen this before. Actually, you haven't. Yes, it's Cornell, not UVic, but there are obvious sequential, which you can see here especially as we skip to Alan Edwards' watercolor drawing demonstrating what the campus could look like if built out according to this plan. And it was Edwards' drawing that was often repeated in the press in support of the university. The landscape plan was very important from the very beginning, the landscaping aesthetic. And although in the correspondence there's various references to it, it wasn't really until 1968 that John Lancias sort of pulled it all together with a report, and I quote here from it, which you can see on the screen, which sort of summarizes how the university landscape elements were to be handled. And so look at, was to reflect the native plant material of Vancouver Island, create an imaginative environment with such plants as Garry oak, arbutus, dogwood, and other conifers. A major tree framework to bind it together. And most important, and must receive, and that this is the most important element, and you'll see this in a few pictures in a minute. This tree framework of evergreen trees, broadleaf and conifers will be used primarily in mass to frame vistas, soften the architectural elements as backgrounds, and as extensions of the forest areas. The open areas will be contoured lawns which merge into the native forest. Clive Justice was responsible for the first quadrant. As you can see, far right building, the first left building, the sciences building, just been completed. The library is just under construction, and Clearview is finished, and the sub is finished, as you can see in this first build-out. Almost no landscaping in evident, and the work was about to begin. Now, it's kind of interesting as we move along the role of WBE, particularly Don Emmons, in influencing building design. And I would be the last to argue, by the way, that Worcester Bernardi Emmons influenced any particular individual architect. And that's kind of not what happens in the business anyway. in the design professions, whether you're an artist or an architect, you're in constant touch with what's going on through magazines, journals, tours, travel. So, however, certainly Worcester Bernardi Emmons had a role to critique and nudge along individual buildings. And here was the second building to go up, although it's probably the first designed, and that was the Sciences Building, now known as Elliott. And here's the early model for it. It had been actually developed for, or designed first for the Lansdowne Building by Public Works. The design was taken forward by Andy Cochran, sort of reconstituted for the Gordon Head campus, and with a lecture theatre to be added to it, designed by John Wade, or Wade, Stockdale and Armour, the firm. And you notice what this kind of rather interesting folded plate construction sort of detail of the theatre, lecture theatre. And I just take from the correspondence in the files, and here was just a little clip from it. And he refers to the theatre block. So the building should be kept as a relatively quiet pavilion-type structure that does not overtly insert itself into the pattern of the major buildings around the quadrangle. In this situation, even more than before, the folded plate structure seems out of place and discordant. And we would again make a plea for redesigning it to become part of the broad porch with covered connections between the buildings and around the theatre itself. So there you see a picture of it as built out, responding to Don Emmons' critique. And here you see the interior. The folded plate survives at roof level. You notice how it's been simplified and opened up at both ends, particularly as you walk through. Now, this is interesting. This is the edge of campus where the conifer forest still intersects as it reaches out across the quad. And you can see how Norbury in this photograph has captured that by showing the building. You're looking through it, you look up through the clear story, you're in the forest. But of course, you're also in a building. And the success of the design, the success of Norbury's photograph in capturing that, I think, gives credit to both. And those of us who moved on to digital cameras today, etc., note that, to hold that kind of image with a black and white photograph where you get the inside, the outside, the play of light, the effect of the architectural elements is a masterpiece. Similarly, with John de Castries' Student Union building, put up in 1963. And here, you see these are northern climes. These are not California desert. You can't open up walls up here or do away with roofs. It rains, it gets cold, and yet you also have heat and you like shade during the summer. You have to bring these together, and I think in the Student Union building you get de Castries cleverly playing with the inside-outside through these sculptural pillars on which he, almost like a Greek temple, suspends a sheltering cornice, and the walls kind of almost gestured to sort of podium-like elements that we saw in that earlier Corbusier, and yet it's a design that's compressed groundwood. It doesn't. It's not a major monument. And in Norbury's photograph here, he captures that so well as the skylights flood the interior of the Student Union Lounge with light. Light comes in through the doors and windows, the pillars inside and outside, linking the two for what is, after all, a concrete block building. But as you get this movement between the public plane and the more sort of personal plane or space inside the building. One of the first building to put up, and obviously a lot of thought went into it, and I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes looking at it somewhat closely. It's a John Stockdale Armour designed building, 1962, first building to be actually finished. And notice that Edward's presentation drawing above and the building is finished below make it somewhat easier to read than today, where it's somewhat obscured by later editions. First of all, the base of the building almost disappears, floats above the ground on these pylons. Along the sides, the window spandrels, although maybe you can't quite see it here, are bas-relief sculpted. And then the extruded stairwell elements at each end. On the left, the building site, you can see it under construction. And it was Clive Justice that actually explained this to me, because I'd never really thought about it. But those extruded stairwells, you go up, and on the one side you sort of interact with Bill West's mobile stable sculpture called The Thing, rising through the center of the stairs. But outside, as you climb the stairwell, the windows open out, of course, into the treed canopy, which didn't quite exist when it was built, but now does. So you're actually walking up through the canopy of the trees, and you can see that expressed in the plan, lower right. And finally, this picture through the original lobby shows you how the flooring, the inside becomes the outside the inside, in the treatment of the tile, slate flooring, natural stone used to provide the real lift to the building on the inside, because the glass curtain wall gives away the interior to the exterior on the outside. The library does this in a slightly different manner, again lifting the bulk of the building, i.e. the stacks above the ground. You have the main circulation spaces at ground level, although instead of opening up here, the ground floor is treated for the most part with split rock, although above intersecting between the split rock level and the actual second floor is a clear story that runs as a band right away around the building, which makes it seem to float above it. I didn't mention on the library, of course, was perhaps the most important part of it, the bas-relief panels by sculptor George Norris. And the idea of art incorporated into the buildings was something which Worcester Bernardi Emmons pushed quite aggressively, actually. It was important to incorporate local art and thus bring the architecture, give it a local situation. In Alan Edwards' sketch above, and then notice the landscape treed spine, which was yet to grow in to link these elements of the campus around the central quad, is the McLaurin Building, Education Arts, originally called, by Alan Hodgson. And in it, you can see a concrete essay relieved by brick panels, perhaps a historic reference to the normal school building. After all, this is where the old normal school, i.e. Faculty of Education, to the building to which they moved. And here, without yet having grown in, the landscape looks very architectural and contrived. And the reason is, of course, you're looking at the bones of the landscaping scheme. Here you can see Hodgson's very skillful use of Corbusian pilotes or pylons to raise the building up above the ground, encourage circulation into, around, under it, and of course through it to the public square behind. So to jump to the other side of the coin, as it were. While this was underway, or while it was underway, Richard Biggerstaff Wilson is elected mayor of Victoria and starts to work very closely with Rod Clack, Alan Hodgson, and others, while, as I've discovered, receiving personal advice from Worcester Bernardi Emmons, particularly, first of all, Worcester and then Don Emmons. And here is a letter, an excerpt from a letter, 1960, from Emmons to Wilson. Victoria is probably the only city on the west coast of North America that still has a choice as to whether or not to save the best of the old character of the city. He goes on to encourage Biggerstaff Wilson to do so and to provide leadership to do that. And what Wilson was facing was a pretty serious dilemma. City Council had voted previously to develop a scheme that would see the sell-off of the old City Hall is bulldozed, capture the money involved, and move uptown to another site and buy a section in a commercial development for which they would give increased density and thus get a new City Hall for free and abandon their decaying but heritage monument on the square. And again, Emmons to Wilson, I hope you find it possible to save your City Hall. It is no longer just a matter of replacing something old with something new. A building like the City Hall is part of the fabric and history of the community. Nothing can properly replace it. Success was achieved. It became the 1962 Centennial Project to be funded by the city. The land was assembled, street closures were obtained, and Rod Clack, working again with Clive Justice, puts together a scheme for the square. And you can see upper left how that scheme adopts the ring motif, which was already in play on campus. The same architectural team pretty much assembles for the square, only in this case led by Clack, and John DeCastri produces the city parkade, putting together textured surfaces using breeze block to mask out the parkade elements, but creating an arcade, again, this inside-outside elements around the square. Here you see two of his schemes for the parkade. But, a little differently, was the decision to restore and revitalize City Hall by adding a new wing, and this was undertaken by Siddle, working with John Wade. And the link between the two is an open, glassed-walled sort of atrium that links the two buildings, allowing passage through from the street into the square. The main structures hovering above the podium, screened with metal decorative screens, which often, with the urban architecture, takes the place of treed canopies in creating this kind of light effect of shade in the building. The effects of this, I think, are quite successfully captured in this it's an assembled view of the square, a panoramic view of the square. Alan Hodgson restores the playhouse, and almost right at that time, WBE are working on the concert hall in San Francisco, interestingly enough. And again, a lobby which visually connects to the square, and the restaurant's podia, on their podia looking out onto the square, these two floating elements. To the left, we have lost one recently in the latest renovation of the square. So David Hamilton, working for Wagon Hamilton on the design of inserting the new courthouse and restoring the police station, shows how he was working with these numerous elements to fit in a modern piece with the heritage elements, traditional elements of the square, without overtaking them or overpowering them. And finally, Clive Campbell, having just left the provincial government, joins the boys on the square, and his little senior citizen centre, again, a quite modest little building. It kitty corner to the entrance to Chinatown. So it overpowers neither the major buildings on the square nor the historic fabric adjacent. In fact, provides a little riposte to that of Chinatown. And UVic is on the square. There's its, as you can see, in there are the three pillars, one of which addresses the theme of education, has a sort of an elemental figure at the top holding the UVic crest. And that was Jack Wilkinson's design for the mosaic program for the stelae that anchor the fountain in the middle of the square. So to bring this to some kind of conclusion, first of all, things change at UVic. And in 1969, WBE, Professor Bernardi Emmons, was given over for Arthur Erickson. Arthur, having become very well known for his Simon Fraser monument on the hill, becomes the lead consulting architect for the planning and design of UVic. And his major contribution is the Cunningham building to the left, and bringing in Barry Downs for the Sedgwick buildings on the right. As you can see, just a very quick look tells you this is a very different kind of architecture. Powerful, heavy, unrelieved grey concrete, massive forms. Yes, behind a screen of trees, but there it is. And the campus design starts to respond. Here, for instance, are two buildings by Wagon Hamilton. The little student service building to the left with its textured elements and floating roof plane above the clear story, a breezeway through, very sort of site sensitive, or would be when the trees grow in. And then the designs for the remake or additions to Clearhue, where you are faced with a much heavier palette of forms. And the intersection with the ground is much less, well, I would say, delicate. With the Cadborough Commons and Lansdowne residences, you begin to see this aesthetic play out in a much more sort of dramatic way. The Commons, a very heavy, robust building. The Lansdowne residence is noted again for unrelieved concrete surfaces, well, striation textured somewhat, but and very dense. Almost, well, students even call them cold. But what you have, of course, is the modern concrete brutalism of Erickson's early constitutional work at play on campus by way of direction or influence. Compare those with Siddle's earlier Commons earlier residences, the Craigderrick, where, as you can see, an emphasis on sheltered breezeways, arcades, balconies, verandas, interaction with the landscape, even bringing the landscape up to the level of the main floor, just kind of to bring the two together. A very different approach. So, looking around now at this kind of aesthetic in the broader landscape. Here's Alan Hodgson's Warren residence. And this kind of architecture has since been called, given a name called critical regionalism, and I won't get into all the details of why it's critical and why it's regional, but the name comes from the idea of taking the modern precepts, the precepts of the modern movement, simplifying form, working with more elemental shapes, reducing your palette of textures, but questioning, querying, interrogating that in favor of setting, environment, landscape, tradition, local building traditions. And Warren Residence, 1969, is, I think, a very good essay along those lines of a house fit into the West Coast environment. Inside, as you can see, bringing light down through clerestory and rooftop windows. Lower right, Alan's own home over in Vic West. In this case, built into a rock bluff almost, and riding along its edges. John de Castry takes an old barn for Colin Graham, Colin, the director of the art gallery, and his wife Sylvia, and modernizes the barn, but working here with a traditional built form. There it is, what can you do with it? And it was well published in its day as an inventive piece of development modernism. John was noted for reaching out into Corbusier, but particularly Frank Lloyd Wright. And in this house actually sort of Langford way, these floating roof planes, almost cantilevered from columnar elements, checked with or filled in with cedar and drop siding, windows right up against the roof, backdrop the trees. You take that idiom and localize it, and within the John's perhaps one of his most famous houses was the Trend House. This was a house done within a series, like those case studies from California, where they were commissioned by the Canadian Woods Trade Extension Bureau to show what could be done with wood. And here you get the elements of the house dissolving and then reinserting themselves against elemental forms like the chimney, which was a good Frank Lloyd Wright trick, but also into and through and out into the garden, and capturing marvelous views that from the living room windows, as this house is nestled into the lee of the escarpment that surrounds it, just backs from UVic. Two very different approaches, in one for Siddle, where Robert Punderson designed almost like a Japanese tea house that floats above its garden elements, almost unsubstantial, compared to John de Castry literally celebrating a bluff top or a hilltop peak, a rocky hilltop peak, just inside the Uplands estates, with marvelous views, by the way, out over the San Juan Islands from here. At the urban level, you see how they play with form. The general paint store, this reticulated open windows giving on to planters, above which hovers this quite dramatic roof, cantilevered out from the rear wall. And the Ballantyne's flower shop series, just recently restored on Lower Douglas, and then the fire hall by Rod Clack with its substantial building hovering above the actual engine shed below. So we've covered a lot, and we've traveled far, although it's all within our own region. And I hope I've left you with some elements other than a impatience with black and white pictures, but how modernism changed the landscape of Victoria and defined the modern heritage of the University of Victoria, which we enjoy today in both Centennial Square downtown and the restored Old Town, and our campus here. Thank you very much.